Good evening, everyone. Hi, this is Sumit Vajpayee. Welcome to the course Introduction to Web Programming with HTML5, and we're going to get started with HTML. Right. So, just to talk about using HTML, so what we're going to do in this 1 hour session is we're going to learn about HTML, how we reached HTML5, right? What are the technologies evolved from web technologies perspective? What is a HTML document? What does an HTML document consist of? How do you write a simple HTML page, right? So that's basically the agenda. Now, this is a session which is going to be a target for audience who have worked with HTML or maybe wanting to learn HTML or who have already know what HTML5 is, or maybe just wanting to know more about what can web programming bring to them. So this is all what goes in for introduction of web programming with HTML. So it's a 10-part series, out of which the first one talks about simple introduction to HTML, and we'll talk about in more details with upcoming sessions on HTML5, right? So this is a very first session which is targeted with working up with HTML, right? So this course is brought to you by OdinSchool, which is a technology upskilling platform, and we help you continuously to acquire new skills where new skills can help you to go ahead in your professional life. So stay skilled, stay ahead. I'm Sumit Vajpayee. I'm having 14 years of experience in corporate IT training and software development. I'm a mean, and a full stack technology expert. And my other skill sets include Angular, React, Vue, GraphQL, MongoDB, Node, AI, machine learning. So if you're interested in, along with the web programming, if you're interested in any of these technologies, do let us know in the comments. Right. So let's understand, why do we learn web programming, right? Why I require web programming as a skill set. Now, as I said, you may be a novice, you may be someone who maybe have working some programming skills, you may have been some experience with non-web programming languages, let's like C, C++, maybe working up with the desktop applications. Now you want to be in the web environment. Now, why does everyone want to be in the web environment? Because web is hot in the market, right? When we talk about trending technologies, web programming is one of the trending technologies in the market. So if you see, not only talking about HTML, CSS and JavaScript, which is basically the trio, these are the basic foundation platforms for learning or doing anything onto the web, onto the internet. Now, as you know, everything is online, and we cannot deny the fact from saying it that from past 6 months we have been virtually living our life on the virtual environments and platforms given to us, right? So web programming, okay, internet is an inevitable part of our life, and we would want our application or our presence as an enterprise, as an individual, to be there on the web, right? And for that you need to learn web programming. So where does this concept come from? When in 1990s, when we had the www outburst, which we basically call it as World Wide Web outburst, right? So the birth of internet was there, and when we saw that the internet was born to share information, right? That was the primitive motive of why we learn things to put it on the internet. So the primitive motive of web was to have some content which would be available across the different sites reference to countries or time zones and things. So I'm not worried about that. That will be available 24/7 /65, and then I can get back to the users specifying, okay, this is the URL, and this, by this URL you'll be able to get back to website. Okay, so what we did, we just went ahead, had our information stored into what we call as pages, right? And collection of those pages formed a website. So website is a collection of web pages brought together and hosted onto a server. So we'll talk about client, we'll talk about server and things, but let's say there is some box where these web pages reside. And who develops them? The web developer develops them, and he tries to put them onto the box. Now that box, as we call it as a server, is someone who is going to listen to the requests that everyone is going to make. But how does anyone reach to you? How does anyone know, okay, this is how I will get the information about LinkedIn, or this is how I'll get information about Microsoft or Google? I need to have the URL. So the URL is unique resource locator, which will tell us, okay, by having this bunch of strings format in the format of URL, okay, the user will be able to have an access to my website. Fine. So that URL we share it to the outside world, and the outside world can just log in using a client. We'll talk about client, as I said, using a browser, and that browser can be any browser. It can be Chrome, it can be Firefox, Mozilla, Opera, Edge, and Microsoft Internet Explorer for that matter, right? So when the user has that information, he goes back and browses your information. He can get back to you. He can send some messages. Okay, he can know more about you, what products you deliver, what all things you do. So all this is a part of making the web as a platform where you can share some common static content with the outside world. So that was the primitive motive when the web was born, right? But when we talk about web, it has been evolved right from its birth till what kind of applications we create in web today, right? So there have been technologies which are evolved. There have been different languages which have evolved over the web, and as I said, currently web is one of the hottest thing in the job market, as well as the trending technologies if you see around. Okay. There are other technologies as well, like for example, if you talk about AI, machine learning, yes, they are trending, but integration of them with web is also true. So a simple example can be using a chatbot. So that's a very simplest example of AI and machine learning being integrated with the web environment. So if you want your applications to have all of these things, you need to learn the web programming, right? And that's where we get started. So when you talk about web programming, it's a lot more deeper concept, okay, as compared to just having HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right? So it's not only HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but there are a lot many things which are included in web programming, fine. But to get started, you have to work with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, because there are technologies which have evolved over these three things, right? So there are different libraries and frameworks which have come on top of let's say JavaScript. There are even libraries and frameworks which work on top of CSS. For example, if I talk about some of the libraries and frameworks like React, Angular, Vue, these have built on top of JavaScript as a language. If you talk about different libraries and frameworks like, for example, Bootstrap that Twitter gives you, it's used for styling things in your application. So that's based on CSS, right? So if you see around, these form the foundations of the web, and we basically talk about enhancing all these technologies and using it into our application based on to this foundation, right? So what's the agenda? So I'm going to learn HTML, CSS, and JS introduction. Fine, we'll talk about the trio. Fine, then layouting a page with HTML5. Okay, we'll talk about HTML5 as well, but we'll also talk about HTML5 in more great detail later on as we move ahead with the sessions. Then we're going to use an IDE, which is the integrated development environment, okay, which is Visual Studio Code, and some of it plugins which can help us to run an application in a very simple manner, right? And once we're done with that, then we'll also be writing a sample page, okay, with the Visual Studio Code that we have written, and we'll be validating our HTML page. So what do you mean by validating an HTML5 page is what we'll be talking about as a full section, right? Okay, so let's understand the trio. So as I briefed you around that, talking about the web technology world, fine, we have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript as the trio, right? So the term web programming encompasses a broad spectrum of technologies that together provide a compelling platform for building great web applications. And not only these, as I've said, there are different technologies and frameworks evolved on top of these. So HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, these are the basis and the foundations of the web. Now these collectively are said as a foundation, because earlier when you talk about just HTML, we say HTML is basically used to have the web content and the instructions for that web content, how my web content should be shown in, right? That's what HTML does. So we're going to talk about HTML more in great detail. Then what is CSS? CSS as cascading style sheet. Now these cascading style sheets which contains the styling rules that define how the content is to be presented. So HTML defines what needs to be presented. Fine. Also, along with its markup instructions, CSS tells how it should be presented. Fine. With some styling. So you apply some styles by using CSS. Then you have JavaScript, which is different from HTML and CSS. So JavaScript is a programming language. CSS is not. HTML is not. So even though HTML says hypertext markup language, it's a language that consists of tags, whereas JavaScript, it's a language which can have some code, some programming like constructs like you write in C, C++ or Java. So you can have some coding being done in JavaScript, which basically provides client-side scripting and advanced capabilities, right? So here, when we talk about JavaScript, it's one of the hottest thing in the market, because as I've said, there are many libraries and frameworks based on top of this JavaScript as a language. So you have this JavaScript as a language also evolved. So if you have heard about the term ES5, ES6, ES7, ES Next, there are different versions of JavaScript which have come up, right? So it's not actually versions of JavaScript, they are versions of a standard that JavaScript implements, right? So if you stick up with this course, you will learn all of these new trends which have evolved over the JavaScript as a language, right? So that's the trio. So as a web developer, you must be mastering these three basic things like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right? Now, when we talk about using these HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, so the question is, while I write a simple HTML page, so I said when we create a web application or a website, it's nothing but a collection of web pages. So collection of web pages which are interlinked with each other. So we'll talk about that in more great detail right now. And when I'm saying it's a website which contains collection of web pages, what those web pages contain? And as I've said, using HTML, that web page will contain the content that needs to be presented in the client or displayed out in the UI. And that's what we say. So in the user interface, find how is the content to be referred. Then you have CSS which applies styling, as I've said, and you have JavaScript to be used. Now, so as a very no voice, you don't require these three things into a page by default, right? But combination of these three things form what we call as dynamic HTML, right? So earlier, when we used to create a simple website, so when website creation was kind of new and the internet was new, we just went ahead and created some static content because that was the motive of the internet, to share the information. So CSS can help me to have some stylings being done. So I want the header to be at the top, I want the footer to be at the bottom, I can have the margins being left behind. So all of this can be managed by using CSS. But when we talk about using JavaScript, JavaScript was used to add some dynamicism. Fine. It means if you want to perform some actions, let's say for example, HTML can allow you to create what we call as a form, right? So if you want to enter something, let's say you are having a sign up form or a sign in form. So when you visit a website, either you can sign in or you can sign on. So when you're signing in, let's say, or logging in, you have the text boxes where you can enter the values, right, the credentials, and then you click on the sign in button. So when you click on the sign in button or a submit button, what needs to be done after the button is clicked? HTML and CSS cannot help you. So for that programming stuff, you require JavaScript. So JavaScript is a language which allows you to add some dynamicism, right, on top of the static web content. So if you have not entered the username while signing in, and if you click on the button, you can use JavaScript to understand that the user has clicked onto the button. So it can interact with the user interaction, when it can understand the user interaction, and then it would also let you write a program where it can check, it can have the business logic of checking whether the user has entered some credentials into the text box. If that is so, then that's right. If not, I can convey the message back to the user saying that these information must be filled up and you cannot bypass these, right? That's what JavaScript is basically used for. Right? So HTML, CSS and JavaScript is what we use as the basis for creating a web application. Now in this session, we are going to talk more on the HTML front, right? So if you talk about the hypertext markup language, which is basically the full form of HTML, but before that, let's have a look at what a markup language is. So markup language, it's a computer language that uses tags to define elements within a document. Okay, so there is a lot of stuff. So I understand, okay, markup language is a computer language that uses tags. Okay, so what is a tag? Yes, we'll be talking about it. To define elements, okay, what is the element? Yes, we'll talk about it. And within a document, okay, what is a document? We'll talk about document as well. But if you talk about a markup language, just consider, let's say for example, you have written a paper, fine, you have solved your exam on a paper, and then the invigilator is going to see the answers, correct it, mark it. Okay, so it's going to say maybe if you've written the correct answer, he will just put a tick onto it, meaning that yes, you have written the things correctly. But if you have not, then he will put a cross sign onto it. So he is marking up something to understand that okay, this is an indication that things are right, this is an indication that the things are wrong. So the markup is what you are telling the intended entity. So here the wrong or the cross sign by the invigilator is understood as a wrong thing, as a wrong answer, but a right indicator is nothing but an indication of a correct answer. Fine, that's a markup on the page. But here when we talk about creating a markup language, it's nothing but what it consists of tags. So we'll talk about tags just in a while, but just understand that it's going to consist of tags. So tags are nothing but something which is written in an opening and ending of a bracket, fine, which is angular bracket that you basically use in, fine, which is the less than and the greater than sign. So we'll just have a look at the tags in a moment, but that's what a markup language is. So it is human readable, meaning markup files contain standard words rather than typical programming syntax. So you don't have to write classes, you don't have to write any instructions, you don't have to have any variables and things to be there in the markup language. They contain rather words, okay, which typical programming language may not directly have. So while several markup languages exist, the two most popular are HTML and XML. Right? So HTML, which is hypertext markup language, and XML, which is extensible markup language, these two are the most widely used applications of markup languages. So let's understand the first line that said a markup language is a computer language that uses tags to define elements. So we're going to talk about tags, we're going to talk about elements, and we're going to talk about document as well. But before we do that, let's understand what is this hypertext, because when we talked about hypertext markup language, that's what HTML means. So we understood markup language, okay, it's language which is consisting of tags, maybe which can have an elements, put it into a document. As I said, we'll be talking about these three things in more great detail, but it also contains the first letter as H, which basically stands for hypertext. So what is this hypertext? Hypertext is text which contains links to other texts, and the term was coined by Ted Nelson around 1965. So that's how old the hypertext as a term is. Not HTML, but yes, hypertext as a term is. Now here, why would you call why would you have hypertext being named in HTML? Because as we see our websites, and I said websites are a collection of web pages, and these web pages are interlinked with each other. So if you see any website, if you go to let's say any of the websites, so you need XYZ website, normally let's say if you go to Microsoft.com, now Microsoft.com would have different links, right, different pages to be shown in. So it will have about page, you can have careers, fine, it can have products, fine, it can have services, it can have n number of things to be used in. and that's why these pages, which are different pages, are interlinked with each other, and that's the reason why we call them as hyperlinks. So hyperlinks is actually something which attaches a page to something else. Fine. So two pages are related to each other by using hyperlinks, and hypertext is a text that contains these hyperlinks. Fine. That's what an hypertext is. So along with hypertext, we also have hypermedia. Okay, so I understand hypertext. Hypertext is something which is having some text with links, and those links would navigate me to some different page, fine, which will take me to a different page altogether. But what is hypermedia? Hypermedia is a term used for hypertext which is not constrained to be just text. Because if you see the websites, they contain audios, videos, images, so there are n number of things that occur that today's web application can contain. And such things, such graphics, videos and sound are termed as hypermedia. But we don't call HTML as hypermedia markup language. We call it as hypertext markup language. It is a generalized way of saying, okay, hypermedia can also be a part of the hypertext, which is fine, right? And this hypermedia is collectively a part of the text that you'll be grading for, right? So we have two terms, hypertext and hypermedia, out of which we just specify from an HTML perspective, okay, we are just referring to the hypertext markup language, which includes this graphics, video and sound as well, right? Okay. So this hypertext markup language, what it is? The hypertext markup language is a standard markup language for documents designed to be displayed in a web browser. Yes, now there are entities which you may have heard or you may have used it, but I'm going to show it here. So let's say, for example, when I say hypertext markup language, I understand hypertext is some text which contains links. Markup language is a language that consists of tags. So we have not yet seen the tags, but we'll be seeing that in a moment. And the standard markup language for documents, we are going to talk about documents as well, and designed to be displayed in a web browser. So your web browser is the target audience for a web page. So when you write a web page, you do not write it for yourself. Now, as I gave an example of the invigilator, the invigilator is writing or taking up a sign only for him to understand. So when he counts the marks, he will be counting the ticks which are indicating the correct ticks, and he will be just neglecting the ones which are there for the wrong marks. Fine, he will not be counting that in. So when he counts with the correct tick in picture, he will count the mark also included corresponding to that tick. Now when he is counting it, he is the one who is the target audience for the paper that you have written for, right? But when we talk about the markup language, who is the target audience? The target audience is the web browser and ultimately the user who is going to view your website. So web browser is again a software. We also call it as a client. So client or a web browser is nothing but a software, a piece of software which is installed onto a machine. I'll not say only machine, because you can install it also onto your different devices like laptop or tablets, even mobile phones, and then use that software as a client. So when you create an HTML page, it is web browser who understands this hypertext markup language. Fine. So it is the web browser for which we are writing the HTML page, and web browser basically understands this. Right. So let's talk about a document. So as we were discussing earlier, that hypertext markup language is the standard markup language for documents designed to be displayed in the web browser. So what does that documents mean? A document, when I talk about, is something which has a structure, which has a format, right? So when you write a document, you have to follow a structure, you have to follow a format, and when you follow that format, right, when you follow a structure, that's where this document is formed. So you have document saying, now you don't, I'm not specifically meaning a Word document or any other document, fine, but I'm saying an HTML document, which basically says it's a file that's going to have some structure defined. right? So HTML document, it's nothing but something which can be passed or consumed over the internet. Fine. So HTML is generally produced and consumed as a document. A website will respond to a request with a complete HTML document, which is then passed by the client and rendered onto the device. So this is same as what we discussed on the last slide, that it is the web browser for which we have targeted this HTML document. So when we write a web page, it's ultimately written as an HTML document. Now why it's a document? Because it has a structure. You cannot just go in a haphazard way and write anything that you wish like. It has a structure. It has a structure that the browser understands. It has a structure targeted for the browser to understand. Right? And a website has collection of these HTML documents, which we call as web pages. Right? So to understand this next line, which is a website will respond to requests with a complete HTML document, we need to understand a relation between what we call as a client and a server, right? So we'll be talking about client, we'll be talking about server as well. Fine, when we'll be creating an HTML file or document, and then we'll be seeing it onto a client and a server thing. So we'll be discussing on the client and we'll be discussing on the server more onto that as well, right? So let's understand the terms. So this is how you create an HTML document, right? So what you see on your screen is an example, a simple example of how an HTML page can be created, right? So you may have worked with this earlier, but if not, I'll just be letting you know and breaking this down to make you understand what this example means, right? Now the first thing which you see is a doctype. So we'll be talking about that. Then the next thing that you see is HTML, fine, and that's what you call it as a tag or an HTML element. So here HTML, head, title, body, these are tags, fine, and within these tags you write the intended code. Fine. Now as I said, every HTML document needs to have a structure, and that's the structure that an HTML document should minimally have, right? Now we'll talk about this doctype in more detail when we talk about HTML5, right? But this HTML, okay, the second line that you see is something which you will be requiring to understand that HTML is nothing but the main tag from which the browser understands that this is an HTML document, fine. Then it has head, title, body. These are different elements. These are different tags, okay, which are present, and these are being predefined. So HTML has predefined set of tags that the browser understands, okay, as compared to XML. So in XML we do not need to have predefined set of tags. We can create our own tags, but XML usage is completely different than HTML. Okay, HTML is used for presentation in the UI, whereas XML is used for data representation of what you want to store. Maybe you can store it into some files, XML files, transfer over the internet and things like that, that you do not intend to do with HTML, right? So HTML, which is a markup language used for presenting your content into the browser, and that's a simple example of working up with HTML, right? So don't worry, we're going to have a look at all of these details, like what this HTML is, what is this lang, okay, what is this head, why do you use title for, body, and things like that. That's what we'll be demystifying today, right? So HTML element or an HTML tag, an HTML element generally follows this structure, okay? So the content, okay, which is the thing with the tag, okay, for example, the document title, my first HTML5 document, is present within that tag. Okay, so it's a starting and an ending of it. So whereas, so if you see this HTML or head or title, any of these that you take in is considered as a tag, right? Now there are two different types of tags. One is companion tag and second is self-contained tag. So generally tags and elements are interchangeable, right? So you don't have to always say that, okay, this is HTML, or this is HTML element, or this is HTML tag. They can be used interchangeably as well. So you can go back and say, okay, this is an head element. You can also say it's an head tag. Okay. Now, why two types of tags? Now, two types of tags which HTML allow you to write are companion and self-contained. Now, if you closely have a look at, if you see title or head for that matter, that's a companion tag. Now, why it's a companion tag? Because it is going to have the start of a document, okay, a start of a tag, okay, within the document, and end of it within the document as well. So it's going to have a companion tag with the / tag being the end of it, right? Okay, so that's what is a companion tag. Whereas if you see meta, find the meta, which is char set is equal to UTF-8, is an self-contained tag, right? Now these again are predefined. You cannot have all the tags being written as companion tags or all the tags written as self-contained, but you will not have an error. So we'll talk about the errors and things in HTML, right? Versus, so I'll compare errors versus validation, right? So don't worry, we'll be talking more onto that front. But as this point, I want you to understand that there exist two types of tags. One is companion, and which has an same name as the starting tag. It just has the / also with it at a start. And you have self-contained tags which contain the elements and have the ending tag contained within itself only, right? So there are different types of tags. We're going to talk about them as we move ahead. So that's your HTML element, right? Now you have a doctype element as well, right? So each page should specify the version of the specification that it was written against. So this doctype that you are writing as the first line in your HTML page or HTML document is something that you focus on the specification. Now what is specification is, if you talk about HTML, that's a standard, that's a specification. There are some set of rules which must be followed, right? So you don't, so when you say HTML5, surely there must be HTML4. Surely there must be some previous version or prior versions to HTML5. We didn't started off with HTML5. So these versions and the specifications that we are talking about are nothing but set of rules that a document must follow. Like every HTML page must start off, so the parent element should be HTML. That's a rule, fine. Then it should have head and body. That's again a rule. Fine. So these are some things which you must follow as a specification, and that's what the doctype element do. Now you can't use multiple doctype elements, and doctype elements basically tell you the version of the specification that this page is written against. Okay, and the current version is HTML5. Now you don't need to go back and write HTML5 there, because that's what HTML5 expects. Okay, I'll set doctype as HTML, so this is HTML5 compatible page. Right? We'll talk about that compatibility and validations as we move ahead. So now we understood what are tags. Let's understand the categories of tags. Right? So you have page tags, which occur only once per page. For example, HTML is a page tag. You have head as a page tag, title as the page tag. Fine. You have body as a page tag. Yes, these are page tags which occur only once on your entire HTML page. Then you have formatting tags, okay, which affect the look and feel of the text, right? So for example, if I say italics, the I tag that's there, fine, and that's an formatting tag. A strong tag or a bold tag, that's an formatting tag, which affect the look and feel of a text. Fine. So if I say H1, that's again a formatting tag, because that changes the font of what it is contained into. So H1 to H6 are different heading tags, and they are also kind of formatting tags because they affect the look and feel of the text contained within those tags, right? Then you have programming tags, like for example script, no script. These are programming tags. So the script tag allows you to write JavaScript code contained within it. And that's why you call them as programming tags, right? So you should write some logic within them. So it's not intended to render something into the browser, but it's intended to execute some code within the browser, right? Then you have forms input tags, which take the input from the user, fine, like I talked about text box, fine, I talk about button. So when you click on the button, you are intending to perform some action, fine. So you as a web developer can take the input from the user, fine, and that's what these form or input tags mean. Then the next set of tags are semantic tags. Now these are new with HTML5. So they clearly describe their meaning in a human and a machine readable way, right? Generally, what we're talking about right now, I'm not specifically talking about HTML5 features, but yes, whenever they pop out, I'll let you know that this is HTML5 feature. Like for example, semantic tags are HTML5 features. Now what they are, how to use them, they will be followed in the further sessions, right? So what does semantics tags do? They clearly describe their meaning in a human and a machine readable way. It means they mark something as a header, they mark something as a footer. So if you have your content to be displayed into the UI, and if you know this is going to be the header of my content, you mark it with a header tag. So that's an example of semantic tag. So it's basically for the developer to understand, okay, this is my content and this is my content going inside a header and what it should be marked with, right? So it does not have much of an effect onto the browser. We'll talk about semantic tags, as I said, as we move on with the further sessions. Okay. Then another category of tags is image and the list tags, right? So you have rendering an image or a collection in an ordered or unordered list, fine, of items that you want to show in. So images also form a very important part of an application, because as you know, a picture conveys more than 1,000 words. So if you want to go back and have something, a picture to be there in your web application, you can do by using this image tags, okay, which have been given. And the list, like if you have some courses to be shown, products to be shown, you can have them to be shown in this list items. Okay, that's what the list tags basically contain. So don't worry, we're going to have a look at them practically as well as we move on. Now, before we move on to the hands-on, let's also understand HTML attributes. So what are HTML attributes? Now, HTML attributes are something which provide extra information about the element, right? So HTML attributes are used to provide details about an element, and the HTML element, for example, contains lang equal to en, which informs the browser that the content is written in English. So attributes are extra information about the element. So if I just move back to see the example that we were working on, right? So this is an example where we had, so here the lang that you see, lang equal to en, is an attribute, right? So that's what we call as an attribute. So attributes are nothing but a way of giving some extra information about the element. So there are some predefined set of attributes available with every tag that you're having, some global attributes which are present, and you can use them with those particular HTML tags, right? Okay, then let's see how do you work with each of these and use it into the hands-on. So what I'll be using, so from tooling perspective, what I'll be using is Visual Studio Code. That's a freeware from Microsoft. You can go back and download Visual Studio Code. Now it doesn't have to be Visual Studio Code, it can be any IDE, any integrated development environment that can speed up your application creation time, right? So rapid application development is what you can achieve by using such IDEs. Now people who get started with web programming, they get started with Notepad and Notepad++, which I do not recommend, because that's not going to give you any intelligence or any plugins or any added features which you would ideally want from an IDE. Now you can use Visual Studio Code, which is my preferred way of going ahead with the things. If you don't want to use Visual Studio Code, there are other options, like you can use Sublime Text, fine. You can go back and use WebStorm, so Eclipse. So you have n number of editors out there which can allow you to create a simple HTML page, fine, and that too working with not Notepad and Notepad++, right? So that's one thing that we'll be requiring, which is Visual Studio Code. And the second thing is Google Chrome. So Google Chrome is something that I'll be referring as an browser. Fine, we will be testing it with different browsers as well, but most of the time I'll be investing the time in Google Chrome, right? So let's see how to work with an Visual Studio Code. So if you download, fine, you can download, as I said, you can download Visual, you can search in Google for Visual Studio Code, you can download this and you can just install. So when you install Visual Studio Code, this is how it looks like. Now it may be looking a bit lighter because I've just changed my preferences. So if you just go into File, Preferences, Color Theme, you'll be having this light Visual Studio or Light Plus as the default lighting thing that's being implemented. But now I've just changed for a better UI to be depicted for you. I've just used a Material Theme High Contrast as an theme. Fine. So that's not very relevant. So you can ignore that. You can just work with the light theme that's there, but that's customizable. That's another advantage that you get with Visual Studio Code. So this is the first interface that you get with Visual Studio Code. Now, most of the time we are interested in the icons which are there on the left hand side, right? So you have Explorer, which is the folder Explorer. Second icon is for searching any things into your project, searching and replacing. Then the third icon is for integrating your code with any repository, like so any source control repository, okay, like Git, for example, most of the time. So you can do that. Fourth is for debugging. Fine. So if you have written some code and you want to debug something, you can actually do this by using this fourth tab. And fifth is an extension. Now this is one of an important part where you can invest more of a time on searching on extensions that you can add on. I'll be talking about one of the extension that I'm using, fine, for creating a web page, right? So we'll be talking about the extension as we move ahead. But out of this, I just want to create a simple plain HTML page, and this HTML page is something which should be rendered into the browser. So let's go back and create one. And a very simplest way, I'm just going to click on Open Folder. I'm going to go back and have any folder being open. So let's say if I go back to OdinSchool, I'll just go back and create HTML basics. It's any folder I'm creating in, and this HTML basics is the folder which is created, and I just opened it up. Right now, when the folder is open, you see 4 icons, right? So you have new file, you have new folder, fine. You can refresh your Explorer, fine. If some files are being copy pasted, you are not seeing that, you can just refresh. If files are being deleted but they are not being updated, you can just refresh and things would work fine. And then the fourth is for collapse folders in Explorer, right? So let's click on the first link, which is creating a new file. And now, as you know, it's a crime not to start a training with hello world. So I'll just say hello HTML dot HTML. So either you can give an extension of .htm or .html. So .html is the preferred way, and that's what you're going to create it. Right now, here with our plain HTML file, okay, that I have created, I can go back and write something of my own. Like I can go back. So if I type in, can you see the IntelliSense? So this is what we call as IntelliSense, which is being popping up by the IDE. So that's where the IDE helps, right? So you have HTML being typed in, and the moment I just select this HTML and I complete this, you see the autocomplete in picture, right? So this autocomplete allows us to have rapid application development, right? And that's the reason why we choose IDEs for doing that stuff. Right? Now here, if you wish, like, you can go back and have HTML. Then HTML has 2 parts. One is the head section, second is the body section. So let's understand the purpose of using these 2 tags. So why it has to be head, why it has to be body, right? Now head section is used to contain some information about the page that you do not want to display in the client area or in the browser. So when I type in head, I'm interested in having some information. So it's like metadata, it's data about the data. right? Whereas the body section is intended to have a target area, which is what we call as a client area in the browser. Now, what am I talking about? Let's understand. So here, if you see this, this is a client area. This is where your HTML should be shown in, right? So for such thing, if you want something to be rendered into the UI, you write it into this body tag, right? And if you want some information about this data that is going inside the body, use head for it. For example, so we'll be exploring more into the head as we move ahead, but if you just want to have an overview, we can write styling things into head. We can have script tag into head, okay, from programming purposes. Then we can have links to different style sheet formats. We can have meta tags contained within it. So this head is having information about all the data that you are going to have as in metadata, right? So that's what head is basically used for. Okay, and anything contained within the body is going to be displayed back into your UI. Now, normally head has a title. Now, as I said, head is basically used for not displaying something into the UI apart from this title tag. So I'll just say first HTML page, right? That's my title. Now, where does this title is going to be shown? It's going to be shown in where the new tab is being displayed, right? So that's where the first HTML page is going to understand. So title here is an predefined set of tag that's being understood by the browser, right? Then we go back and then specify within the body, how do you want a text to be shown? Now, I want this to be an heading. That's why I can use some formatting tags. Let's say, for example, an H1 tag. And here I will say, this is my first page with HTML, right? Now, this page, so what we have written, we have understood, okay, this is a HTML document as we have given an extension of .html, right? Then this is an HTML page consisting of some tags. These are the page tags that we have written. This H1 tag is a formatting tag that I've written, and it's a companion tag. As you can see, fine, it has an H1 element, the content inside it, fine, and this is going to be shown into your UI. Now, there are two ways of viewing this into the UI. One is directly opening up with the browser, and second is by executing it using a server, right? So if I just go back, if you don't want, now you don't know what a server is, I've written it, and the target audience is ultimately my end users who are going to use it, but they're going to browse it using a software which I told is a client, and the client is nothing but a web browser. So how do I do this? How do I open it? So you can just right click onto this HTML page. You can say reveal in the file explorer, fine, where it will be opening up into the folder, and into this file explorer I'll just right click. Because the extension is .html page, you can see it's by default mapped with the Chrome, because that's my default web browser mapped onto it, right? So if you don't want Chrome, you can just right click and say open it up with any of these things which are listed in the list, right? So I'm going to use Chrome, that's okay. And when I use it, you can see this is my first page with HTML, and that being spawned into the UI, right? Now observe the URL carefully. So it's F trainings OdinSchool HTML basics hello HTML.html, right? That's what is going to give you the folder explorer view, because we have run it and just open it up using your browser instance, and the browser understood what this HTML was, and it understood what H1 was, and H1 is an heading tag, and that's why the formatting is being shown into the UI, right? Okay, so that's your simple HTML page being created. Okay, now the other part is you can actually have this HTML page being run via a server, right? So what this server is something that can send this HTML document over the network to the one who has requested it, right? Server, like client, is also a software, right, which can be installed on the machines fine, and you can use those servers and run the HTML page via that. Now, for doing that, we need to go back and install servers onto our machines and then configure and have the HTML page being pasted onto that server, set some headers, okay, maybe the URL and all, and then have that to be rendered in. But I don't want to have such things, complicated things to be done, maybe because this is my first session. So can I simply go back and have a dummy server being used so that these contents are served from the server? Yes, I can. So a dummy server is given to you, and the name of the dummy server is live server. So if you can just search for live server in the extension part here in the Visual Studio Code, this is the live server. And in this live server, as you can install, because I have installed it already, it does not give me or prompt me for installing the thing. So you can see it disabled or uninstalled. So what this live server does, launch a development local server with live reload feature for static and dynamic pages. So it can just host your HTML page onto a server and then emit out the HTML in the browser. So it is as if you have deployed your application. That's what the term we use when we put the websites into a server. So you deploy your site onto a server and then access it using a URL, right? So live server as an extension allows you to save all the complicated things that you would want to do with a configuration of a server, right? So this live server is what I've installed. Now what this does by default is, if you have that installed successfully, you can just right click onto this page, or you can even right click onto the HTML page that's being there on the folder explorer, and you can click on open with live server, right? So if you right click and just open with live server, you would see that this is going to be browsed onto again your Chrome, because that's a default browser being set, right? And you would see now a URL that's different. So you can see 127.0.0.15300 hello html.html, that's being served from your local server. Now what's the advantage? What do I get as an advantage if I'm using a server as compared to what I'm using from the F drive? The advantage is, if I just make any changes, right? If I just make any changes, and if I just go back to my Chrome here with F drive, you don't have anything updated, because you as a end developer, you have to go back and refresh because it is being served from the file explorer, right? So I have to just go back and refresh, and that will be refreshed. But if I just compare this with the first HTML, you already see the changes in place. Anything which I do, so I'll say first ever page with HTML, I can go back and immediately you see first ever is being reflected back. So server here is capable of giving you the updated values, and that's what we call as live server or live coding, okay, live reload. Okay, so you don't have to go back and each time reload your page, and you'll be still there, happy, working up with and seeing your changes back into the UI immediately without you going back and specifically doing it. Right? So this is how you run a simple HTML page. Right? Now, talking about errors. So when we talk about errors in an HTML page, there is a good thing, whereas there is a bad thing as well. The good thing is you never have errors with HTML, right? And that's also the bad thing. It means if I make a mistake in writing this tag, right? So let's say if I go back and I'll say, let's say header 1. Now there is no predefined set of tag called as header 1 in HTML. So if I just view in my browser, you still see the content, but you do not see that in the heading, right? So if I just zoom, you still see the content, but you don't see that as an heading. If I right click, if I go back to inspect, so this is where, so we're going to focus more onto that. So this is where you get developer tools, and as a web developer, you must be very frank opening up this either you say Ctrl Shift I or you inspect, which is the developer tools, right? Any web developer who claims himself to be a web developer must be having a command on working with the developer tools which are given to you by every browser. So Chrome has given you, even other browsers have given you, right? So if I just zoom so that you can see, if I go back to the console, you don't have any errors. So you have different tabs. We'll be investing a lot of time in understanding what these tabs mean. Currently, I'm focusing on this console or maybe the element section. So in the elements, you can see this is your source code. Fine, this is where things are there. We'll talk about this part later on because that's what live server has injected. But you can even right click and say view page source. So in this view page source, okay, you will see now this is about live server. Forget, as I said, forget about this one. You neglect this. This is injected by live server, as you can see, but we are only interested in understanding this part. Okay, so in this HTML page that you are seeing, elements are being shown, and you can see first HTML page is the title. That's what you have set in the title. If I misspell title, then that will not be understood by the browser, right? Okay, so this element section gives me the exact elements which are present onto my page, right? So you don't have errors, but is it a valid HTML page? So errors as compared to validations are a different story altogether, right? So as I said, you don't have errors with HTML. So how do you find errors with it? You find it by validating your HTML, right? So you validate your HTML by copy and pasting it into validators. So there are HTML validators present online. You can even download some of the tools which are HTML validators. So let's check the HTML validator. So in Google, if you just search for HTML5 validator, because that's what we want to validate for, so it'll be navigated to this validator.w3.org, okay, which is W3C, which is World Wide Web Consortium. That's some group of people just standardize the things on the internet. And you can see this validator.w3.org is a Markov validation service, fine, given to you to check whether your HTML is valid or not. Okay, now why this has to be valid? Because this can be a selling point to your client. So anyone who is giving you some application to work on, you will say proudly that yes, my website is HTML5 validated. Okay, so and that is something which is also required by some of the clients, obviously, who are expecting something out of you, and that's why you validate. Now you can validate by URI. Fine, if you have deployed it something online and you're going to have the HTML page being deployed somewhere, you can use the URL. You can upload a file, fine, to be done, or just validate it by the direct input. Right now, if I just paste in the code that we have written, let's validate that, and I'll just click on check. Right now, with this, can you see there are some warnings and error which are being prompted out? So you have the element header h1 not allowed as child element in the body because it does not understand what this header 1 is, right? So that's basically an error. Another warning that it basically says is consider adding a lang attribute to the HTML start tag to declare the language of this document. Fine, so that's something which is kind of also required. But if I take a minimum HTML that we saw in the example, so let's take this HTML and put it into our validator. And now if I just try to check, so I'll just click on check. Now you see document checking completed, no errors or warnings to show. Now if you see, this contains doctype HTML. Fine, so if I just take this off and then try to click on check, this is not an HTML5 valid document. Why? Because an HTML5 document requires the first line to be doctype HTML. And here we said if it is not a doctype HTML, I can go back and write something else as well. So you can see start tag seen without seeing a doctype first. Okay, so expected doctype, which is actually a practice that is basically required as a part. Okay, so sorry, yeah. Then you have HTML lang en, fine. Then you have head. It's not absolutely mandatory to have meta tag. Okay, you can have your title, fine, have hello world inside it. Just click on check, and that's how you basically validate your HTML. So that's what we did in this session. So we had an introduction of HTML, CSS and JavaScript, and we saw it's nothing but an foundation of web programming. Then we created an HTML page, layouting it with HTML elements. So we saw what is an HTML document. HTML document is nothing but collection of HTML tags. It has some basic structures. We saw different types of tags which are available, formatting tags. Then we talked about programming tags. Fine. We talked about semantic tags. All of these tags we are going to see in more great detail with these courses as we move on. We also talked about an IDE, which is the Visual Studio Code, and we have used some plugin which was Live Server. And we also validated an HTML5 page with an HTML validator online. So if you have any questions, you do let me know. How did you find this session? You can also put it in the comment box below. Any questions, anything that you'd like to ask, guys? Okay, so I'll take that as a no. So thank you all for being patient, and please like and subscribe to our channel, and do let us know what you think about this session in the comments. Thank you.